Welcome to the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar is to help provide educational context for the debate topic from our guest speaker's specific area of expertise. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide subject matter expertise regarding the debate topic of the United States federal government's foreign policy towards international terrorism. The format for this evening's webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation from Dr. Jonathan Loopstra and will be followed by a giveaway hosted by our sponsor, the University of Northwestern. Please keep in mind the Q&A function that is available at the bottom of your screen, as we will be selecting one individual who will receive a sweatshirt as a prize based on their engagement throughout this webinar. We will also select 2 individuals at random to receive a free t-shirt prize, and this will be announced following the 30-minute presentation. After the giveaway, we will continue with a 15-minute live Q&A in which Dr. Ravi Paul and Dr. Loopstra will have a discussion responding to the questions you have submitted throughout the presentation. So as a reminder, submit your questions via the Q&A function that's available at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to submit requests for help via the chat function. Our NCFCA webinar tech support team is on the back end and ready to help you in any way that they can. At this point, it is my honor to invite Dr. Ravi Paul to join me on screen as I introduce him to you this evening. Dr. Paul is our NCFCA host for this evening. He is an Associate Professor of Management and Information Systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. He earned both his master's and PhD in Industrial Management from Clemson University after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Bangalore University. Dr. Paul is also an NCFCA parent, debate coach, and member of the NCFCA Debate Committee, and we are thrilled to have him here with us this evening. So Dr. Paul, I will turn it over to you as you introduce Dr. Loopstra.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for getting us started. It is a pleasure to be here, and indeed a pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Jonathan Loopstra from the University of Northwestern. He joined the University of Northwestern faculty after teaching at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. He is also taught at the Reformed Theological Seminary and in the Middle East. In his classes, Dr. Loopstra seeks to encourage his students to improve their understanding of history and the contemporary world around them. At the University of Northwestern, he teaches a wide variety of courses from antiquity through the medieval period. As a specialist in the history of Christianity in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Central Asia, Dr. Loopstra is well equipped to help students understand the complex history of these regions. He works frequently with texts in the Syriac language, a dialect of Aramaic used by Christians in the Middle East. These texts are a largely untapped resource for our knowledge of the history of this part of the world. Much of Dr. Loopstra's current work is also focused on preserving the heritage of Middle Eastern Christianity in the face of the present violence in the region. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Loopstra. You have the floor.
This is actually a good day to talk about the subject of international terrorism. I hope you had a chance to, as students, see the funeral of Senator McCain over in Arizona. Somebody who is very interested in the subject of protecting America and American democracy against international terrorism. And so this is actually a topic that's very relevant today. I've been asked just to give you some overviews. I'm gonna fly maybe a mile high, and then I'm gonna get a little more in depth if you want on the questions. If you look at the at recent newspapers, I just took a look, newspapers and journals this week in preparation for coming here. But you can see this subject of international terrorism is all over the newspapers and journals. I'll just give you some examples here. Maybe you can use these to start in your research on the subject. You can actually find in the July-August edition of the Foreign Affairs magazine. That's Foreign Affairs magazine. You can actually find several good articles, starting places related to US policy on counterterrorism overseas. And this is a big issue for them, is questioning where are we today. Another good place to look is the Council on Foreign Relations. They actually have an excellent website and articles related to this issue. Last year, 2017, the Cato Institute, C-A-T-O, the Cato Institute published a policy analysis study. I thought it was actually quite excellent. The title was Lessons for the United States Foreign Policy on the Failed War on Terror. So that might be another article you want to check out, 2017, the Cato Institute. Also another source just offhand as we start today, the Bipartisan Policy Center. Bipartisan Policy Center published in 2017 again, a study called Defeating Terrorists, Not Terrorism, Assessing US Counterterrorism Policy from 9/11 to ISIS. Again, I'm just setting those out as some examples of articles that might get you going in your research after we talk today. But as a historian looking at this, I'm beginning to realize that 20 years since 9/11 is enough time that people are beginning to ask pertinent questions. We're beginning to have enough time under our belt to ask these questions. Where are we going? And is it working? And it seems like this is the question you're going to be facing in your debates coming up. Maybe we can start off today by looking just first, what's the immediate context of the American war on terror over the last 20 years. I know many of you are 20-year-olds or earlier, so immediate doesn't sound 20-year-old, but believe it or not, 9/11 was a turning point for a lot of us and a turning point for US counterintelligence operations overseas. If you don't remember, 9/11 was a shock to a lot of us. I liken it in my classes to like a PTSD moment. We were attacked, we were afraid. We began to pour French wine in the streets. We began to rename French fries freedom fries. I'm not going to talk about that. You can ask your parents. But again, it was a strange time. In the context of what we're talking about today, American policy towards terrorism changed. We began to develop things like the Department of Homeland Security. We began to go after terrorism abroad, more aggressive policy than had been the case earlier in the 1990s. And so, for example, I'm going to give you three things that changed. There's more than that, but three policies that you can look to in your research to look at what changed in 9/11. Number one, in 2001, as part of the Declaration on Terror, you had Congress authorizing what was called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, AUMP, Authorization for the Use of Military Force for the President. And you can actually find this under Public Law of the 107th Congress, number 40. You can actually Google it later on, right after this talk. But let me just read briefly what that says, right? So pay attention, right? You can read it later, but pay attention, right? This, again, authorization of military force says this, that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States. Again, this is a pivotal moment, right? Notice Al-Qaeda is not mentioned here, nor the Taliban. Does this seem open-ended to you and vague? And it was. right? And this is one of the things you'll want to look at in your debate. Even just this year, Bob Corker and Tim Kaine were trying to revise this statement, right, to limit the powers of the presidency in this regard. But this is debatable. One of the things we've seen happening over Republican and Democratic presidents over the last decade is that they've increased their power, going to places like Mali, Libya, Syria, and using this act as a source for that. The second thing I want to mention that changed after 9/11, and this is kind of the Bush doctrine, it's called the 4D policy. The 4D policy. What are the 4Ds? To defeat Al-Qaeda, right? To deny them a place to be, to train. To diminish the conditions that give rise to terrorism. And to defend the US against future attacks. That means we're proactive now, not reactive, right? So defeat, deny, diminish, and defend the US. These are the 4Ds. Part of your debate might be, have we achieved those aims, right? 17 years down the road. To be honest, most policymakers would say no, right? You can get into that later. The other thing I want to mention in regard to what changed was in 2003, in the aftermath of the initially positive moves in Afghanistan, we began the policy of bringing, quote, freedom and democracy to the Middle East. This was more along the lines of regime change. We saw this in Iraq, and the idea of nation building. So for example, by 2015, we had invested $90 billion of American money into just training Afghan troops. In total, over the years, recent analysis is $5 trillion of US money spent in rebuilding Iraq and Afghanistan, all right? So again, that's another aspect of this policy after 9/11. Has it worked or not, right? This is part of what you'll be looking at. So what are the problems that have occurred because of this? Let's just briefly touch on some of the issues that have occurred and you'll look at in your research. As you do your research, you might want to consider, I strongly encourage you to consider looking backwards, right? Going back after or even before 9/11. You want to look at the Cold War and even the 1990s before 9/11. Remember, the Cold War policy was that of containment. The Americans began to move abroad into Iran, right? A coup in Iran in the 1950s, moved abroad into a policy of containing the Soviet Union, becoming more active overseas. I remember that this amazing moment in 1989, 1990 with the fall of the Soviet Union led to George Bush Sr. calling the New World Order, right? An idea that, what was this? That America could bring peace. I know it sounds strange, but this idea that America as the only superpower could bring peace and enforce the United Nations regulations, right? We saw this in the first Desert War. And why is that important to go backwards? Because all this fits into what people like Osama bin Laden and others saw, right, as they're planning the 9/11 attacks. In terms of terrorism as well, we can go backwards and see that even during the Cold War, you also have both sides, the Americans and the Soviet Union, using quote unquote terrorists to attack the other side, particularly the Soviet Union, right? So you have the Soviets using Fatah in Palestine as a tool towards attacking US interests in the region. So the question you need to face then with all this background is, was there blowback, right, against increasing involvement by America during the Cold War, during the 1990s, and into the post 9/11 period? We call this blowback. Right? Did our involvement actually help us to keep us safer, or did it increase our chances of building animosity against the United States? Most analysts would say that our policy of nation building, while it was a good idea, right? It was a good intentions. It actually, in many times, hurt us in the end. When we went in and tried regime change in many nations, people lost power, groups lost power, and became resentful of America. In addition, it's important to understand there's, in few cases, a tradition of democracy in this part of the world. US military involvement, particularly in Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan also increased the space for anti-US feeling and hatred in the region. A good example of this would be Libya, right? Remember 2011, we had the Arab Spring breaking out. It was a moment for democracy. We were feeling that finally, right, the Middle East would be free for democratic freedom in that region. So the US decided to intervene militarily in Libya. But remember, there's no structure for democracy in Libya at the time, right? There was no other counter to the Gaddafi regime. And as a result, Libya today has descended into the category of a failed state. And you might argue the same with Yemen, which is undergoing severe trials today, and other countries, right? And why is this important for our understanding of terrorism? Because in many cases, it leads to poverty, it leads to frustration, and you have thousands of young men out of work. But as we found, it's not just the poverty, but it's the ideology of radical Islamicism, we'll talk about a little later if we have time, that leads these young men towards jihadist terrorism as well, right? So with that, again, one of the things you want to look into in your research, and we don't have time to get into it here. We didn't have the sound issues earlier, we would have, but I'll just skip over it. But when you look in your research, you might want to consider the idea of a nation state, okay? Remember the idea of a nation state being that a country you consider yourself citizens of, the right to nationhood, the right to self-determination. This is a concept that derives in Europe in the Middle Ages, and many other parts of the world never developed that concept. The Ottoman Empire organized by what we call a mosaic, right? You're first and foremost a part of your tribe, your religion, right? Your family. Many other parts of the world don't have this concept of citizenship of nation states. And the other reason this is important, right, is because quite often many of these quote unquote terrorist groups call themselves freedom fighters. They believe that when the nations were formed, particularly in the Middle East, right, in the 1920s, that their nation was opted out, right, didn't get a chance to develop as a nation. Think, for example, of the Kurds. I lived with Kurds in the region of northern Iraq. I taught in northern Iraq for many years. Many Kurds in the north actually do not speak Arabic, even though they live in Iraq. They don't consider themselves to be Iraqis. As a result, not all are terrorists, right? But some would be a part of groups like the PKK, classified as a terrorist organization, that want to carve out, even today, a part of the national identity in the Middle East. Even think of Osama bin Laden, right? 9/11, one of the first things he does when he attacks America is he proclaims that this is in retribution for the 80 years of humiliation. The 80 years of humiliation. We in the West, we scratch our head. What does he mean by that, right? When I teach my Iraqi students, they know automatically what he means, right? So do the math. Subtract 2001, right, by 80 years, what do you end up with, right? 1921, 1922. What is that? It's the mandate period, right? The period when the Western nations formed the Iraqi nation, the nations in the Middle East, often without the people's consent, right? So again, a lot of what we call terrorism, these ideas go back to the development of nation states in the region and frustrations, continuing frustrations over that. Prime example is the Palestinian issue as well. So this leads us into our second word in our subject, terrorism. What is terrorism? I don't know if you ever thought about that. Terrorism is extremely difficult to define. Right? For your projects, this is going to be a key idea. How do you define terrorism? I'll give you a good source on this. A good source is the Routledge series. The Routledge series publications have a handbook, and this is their handbook on terrorism research. That's the title. So it's the Routledge Handbook on Terrorism Research. It's edited by Myra Williamson. And Alex Schmidt has a good section on chapter 2 you want to look at called What is the Definition of Terrorism? Right? He has excellent sources there. And it's fascinating. What he says in his first paragraph is that 70 years after the League of Nations first proposed to define terrorism in 1937, we still do not have a legal definition of terrorism. We still do not have a legal definition. Isn't that amazing? In fact, in the back of that article, he lists over 250 different definitions of terrorism that are found in the back of his book based off of his research. Interesting fact, he's narrowed down out of those definitions 3 key terms: political, fear, and terror, that occurred in over half of those definitions. So again, this is something you want to look into, right? As you're doing your research, this is the key question: what is terrorism? I have time, so I'll just give you some background. Our earliest references to terrorism actually come from, as some of you might have guessed, right, the reign of terror during the French Revolution. 1794, we have our first mention of the word terror. And it's, of course, it's attributed to the executions on the Robespierre during that period. Again, 1795, it's brought into. Edmund Burke used this word terrorist to describe the actions of the French government. Why is this important? It's interesting, right? Because actually, in this case, the earliest mention of the word terrorism is used to talk about the government that's terrorizing the people, right? The government that's terrorizing the people. In today's terminology, how do we think of terrorism? Kind of the opposite, right? As a people group or a group that's actually attacking the government, right? So one thing to consider is the etymology of the word terrorism. How did terrorism become popular in Europe? Again, we don't have time to get into it here, but it deals with the rise of 19th century political movements. I think this was when Italy was becoming a nation against the French, when Germany. We know, for example, that an Italian called Felice Orsini killed several in a crowd when he tried to bomb Emperor Napoleon III. You know, people began to see this as an opportunity to attack those who maybe are out of reach militarily. Right? You could cause fear in the local public population. One of the main groups that took up this idea of terrorism was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that saw they could use this terrorism against England in the 1880s. So from there, terrorism becomes used as a method and tool of terror against the local population. We have to be careful, remember, with terrorism, because today terrorism is a polemical tool. Just recently, within the last week, right, Bashar Assad in Syria, has called those citizens of Syria who he dislikes terrorists, right? Even in Venezuela, right, this week, you have Venezuelan government, right, calling the US and those who tried to assassinate the president terrorists. So terrorism is a polemical word, right? So you'll want to try to define this. And again, like I said, there's no legal definition that's universally agreed. But let me give you some of the brief overview of what people have said about terrorism. What are some common characteristics? And there's 5 I've picked out. There's more we can talk about. But one of the key characteristics is that it's often indiscriminate. Right? I fell down there. It's indiscriminate. It's against civilian casualties and non-combative targets. Right? So obviously used against civilians. And this is even debatable today, right? So the US military claims that even attacks against US military personnel in civilian clothes is an act of terrorism. Second, this is the big issue, it's largely symbolic, right? So think of Guy Fawkes in England, think of the PLO, right? And the PLO in the 1970s, when nobody was looking at them, what did they do? Remember Dawson Field, right? They hijacked airliners, they evacuated everybody off, and they blew them up on television cameras, right? What were they saying? We're still here, our issue's still here, right? Look at us. And again, you could argue that terrorism works not just for the deed, but for the propaganda of the deed, as we call it, the propaganda of the deed. This is true for 9/11, right? So Osama bin Laden was getting a lot of bang for his buck. He wasn't necessarily wanting to cause a lot of injuries, but it was the publicity that he wanted, attacking the great United States. ISIS, right? When ISIS finally managed to form a caliphate, right? For Muslims around the world, this was a key moment, right? We're recreating the caliphate. Historically, this is a key moment, this idea of a new caliphate, right? You can check it out online. There's a great video, I think it's Vice, of in the early days of ISIS. All right, they went out into the desert. There's nothing around. ISIS went out with bulldozers, right? And they're moving sand around out in the middle of the desert. What were they doing, right? They're proclaiming as they're moving in sand, we're destroying the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Well, we don't know what that is in the West. What was it? Sykes-Picot was one of the agreements that formed the separation between Syria and Iraq in the 1920s, right? So again, this is symbolic, right? Symbolic. Terrorism is symbology. A couple of the characteristics. Thirdly, you have the asymmetric character of terrorism, right? It's a way for the weak to attack the strong, an army to attack those who don't have armies. Think, for example, in 1983, when the attack in Beirut against US Marines killed over 200 Marines and the US withdrew, right? This was looked at, Osama bin Laden looked at as a victory, right? You can use terrorism to attack even the mighty United States, and the US will withdraw. Fourth, this causes us to disregard the rules of warfare. Often terrorism, torture, war, anything goes. Right? A fifth characteristic, and the last one I'll put out here, is that it's often used to raise support. Right? So it's a way to gain, through fear on the enemy's part, support among your own people. And again, this is definitely true with 9/11. One document, let me leave you with here, a brief document you should know, and you can look this up if you want to write it down. It's U.S. Code Title 22, Code 22, Chapter 38. Code 22, Chapter 38, and it's dated to 2003. And this is one of the closest definitions to terrorism we have in the United States. What is this document? Title 2238. This is a document that makes it mandatory for the Secretary of Defense to report the latest status of terrorism abroad back to the Senate. So look that up, and they'll have a short definition there. Again, it's not universally agreed upon. Again, just mentioning there's different types of terrorism. I know in this class we're looking at international terrorism, or for your topic, but be aware and keep this in mind for your debate. We have another thing called civil terrorism, right? Civil terrorism, right? Obviously that's within a nation state, right? So for example, in Syria, you have groups fighting within a nation state, within Syria, fighting against Bashar al-Assad. But be aware that often civil terrorism can lead to international terrorism, right? So why are we involved in Syria, in the east, helping the Kurds in the north? Why are we involved when it's not international terrorism yet, right? Because we don't want it to get to that point of international terrorism, or at least that's the argument. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the different types of terrorism, but be aware that even though you're talking about international terrorism, some areas like even local terrorism, civil terrorism bring in the United States. And you might want to consider this in your debate, right? Because in 2015, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 2015, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that, I'll quote them, more people have been killed in America by non-Islamic domestic terrorists than jihadists, okay? So more people have been killed in America by non-Islamic terrorists than jihadists. Think of Oklahoma City, recent racial church shootings, right? So in your debate preparation, you might want to keep this in mind, right? Why are we so focused on international terrorism when you have local terrorism that's actually causing more casualties and more harm? All right, so just be aware of all that. But since 2000, obviously, religious terrorism has overtaken political terrorism, particularly Islamic fundamentalism. And let me, since we started a little later, let me in 5 minutes, I promise 5 minutes, give you an overview of religious fundamentalism, or rather Islamic fundamentalism. Right? If I can do that in 5 minutes, I'll try. Because it's an important idea, and I'll just give you some basic details, but you'll want to get into it at more length, okay? So remember in 9/11, right, Osama bin Laden attacked America. Again, not a lot of people, I find not a lot of students understand why he attacked America, right? A lot of it has to do with the Cold War, right? So it has to do with Americans' policy in the Cold War in 1990s. But a good section of his understanding, his view of America has to do with the rise of what we call Islamic fundamentalism. Not technically Islam, right? Remember, Islam has many branches, but this is a strand of Islam that really rose up in the 1950s, 1960s. And I'll just give you one name here. If you remember Sayyid Qutb, Q-U-E-T-B, Sayyid Qutb, very famous in the Middle East. He was actually a school teacher from Egypt. He was a school teacher that went to America, actually Colorado, during the Cold War to learn how to be a teacher. And it's an interesting story. When he was there, he encountered miniskirts. He encountered dancing in churches. And he encountered many things that offended him. He began to see America as the source of apostasy, the source of great evil in the world. In Islam, you have something called jahiliyyah, right? And this is an idea, roughly we translate apostasy. And Sayyid Qutb, when he comes back to Egypt, he writes a book called Milestones, right? And in this book, he begins to argue that America is bringing, through Hollywood and all these sources, bringing jahiliyyah, this apostasy all over the world. Why is this important? Because he connects this with the history, the early days of the Islamic world. In Islamic tradition, who erased the apostasy that the world was in? It was the Prophet Muhammad who erased the apostasy. He brought the Quran, right? He led the Arabs to a great age. Remember, the Arabs were the one who brought paper from China, who brought the Arabic numerals to the West, who had this great age from the 9th century to the 13th century or so. So he begins to argue that in order to get back to that great age, historically, what we have to do, right, is bring Sharia law, bring a type of law to America and erase this apostasy. And once we do, then we will once again be a great nation as Muslims, as Arabs. Again, this is just a radical strand, but this is kind of the religious foundation for a lot of Osama bin Laden and radical Islamicists like ISIS. All right, so be aware of that, and you'll do further research on that. Let me give you another source for Osama bin Laden just offhand, because that's the root of a lot of his ideas about America religiously. But in many cases, remember, he's acting politically as well. There's a great resource here right after 9/11, an article by a famous Arab writer from Lebanon. I'll give you his last name. His last name is Al-Azm, A-L-A-Z-M. A-L-A-Z-M. So his name is Sadiq Al-Azm. And he wrote this wonderful article that kind of puts a different light on the 9/11 attacks and Islamicism in the Middle East. And the article is called Time Out of Joint. Time Out of Joint. And in it, he argues that the Arabs are kind of like the Hamlet. Remember Hamlet and Shakespeare? They're the Hamlet of the day. In other words, they remember their past, right? But they're struggling to kind of figure out where they are today, right? So when you think of Islamic fundamentalism, understand, yes, there's a religious component, but there's also this component of many people in that region, right? Struggling to figure out where are we today and where do we go? How do we regain our greatness as well, right? So when you think of Islamic fundamentalism, or when you think of international terrorism, some things to keep in mind. Have we overblown in America, right, the threat of terrorism? Is this something really more of a local phenomenon? Even Islamicism, are they just more trying to gain a foothold locally, politically in the Middle East? Have they really posed a great threat to your average American citizen, right? 1 in 7 Americans stands a chance of getting cancer, right? Far fewer from dying of Islamic fundamentalism or international terrorism. Another question you need to face, even if we have a light footprint in the Middle East or other parts of the world, even a light footprint, is that inviting blowback, as we said, we talked about? The other third question you need to think about as I leave you today is $5 trillion we spent in our efforts over the last 17 years, has it been worth it for the return we've gotten off of our policies of international counterterrorism? Okay, so again, I'll leave you just real quick with some the resources I mentioned. Remember the Routledge Handbook on Terrorism Research, I mentioned that. Also consider the Global Terrorism Database at the University of Maryland. It's an amazing database. You can access it online. So they have over 150 incidents of terrorism. You have another thing called the Global Terrorism Index, right? So keep that on Global Terrorism Index. Another website, very good, Brown University, called The Costs of War. The Costs of War, looking at the effects of our work in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last decade. And lastly, another good resource as you get into this topic is the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Politics. The Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Politics, right? So that's another good resource on international law, on terrorism, and a little bit of history as well. So again, I apologize for getting off to a rough start. I don't know what happened with the sound. I still can't hear anything, but I'll leave it there. I hope that was a decent overview. There's a lot more depth to get into, but I hope this gets you started in your research.
The giveaway winners are, first of all, for engagement and receiving a sweatshirt from the University of Northwestern will be Micah Hines. So Micah, thank you for all of your questions. If you could go ahead and drop your email address in the private chat box here, we will connect with you after the webinar and make sure that you get your free sweatshirt. And then the winners of our free t-shirts will be Riley Garrido and Leslie Burns. So Riley Garrido and Leslie Burns, if you both could also drop your email addresses here in the private chat, we will make sure that you get your free t-shirts from the University of Northwestern. And continuing on while we wait for Dr. Loopstra, I just want to go over a couple of quick product highlights and remind you that we have the NCFCA Comprehensive Guide to Policy Debate, and this includes as a package the coach's manual, the teacher's handbook, and the competitor's handbook as well. And so if you do not already have a resource for your curriculum for this 2018 to 2019 competition season, we would highly recommend that you check this out. We will drop the link for this resource into the chat box so that you can familiarize yourself with what's available. And with that, remember, if you have questions, keep dropping them into the Q&A. We will be fielding them once Dr. Loopstra joins us once again via phone. And continuing on for our highlight, we have the Comprehensive Guide to Policy Debate. We also have the Comprehensive Guide to Lincoln Douglas Value Debate releasing this summer. So know that that is coming, and we are so excited to bring you this resource for Lincoln Douglas debate. In addition, we have the Comprehensive Guide to Speech. So if you do not already have a speech resource, that is available for you as well. All right. I see that our giveaway winners have dropped their email addresses into the chat box. Thank you all so much. We'll be in touch after to make sure that you get your prizes. And with that, I am going to check in with Dr. Loopstra again. So let me leave you with this slide. As a reminder, we will have updates on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter for events that are upcoming. And stay tuned for our September newsletter that is coming, and we'll include all of the details for our September webinar series. We have some really great speakers and sponsors lined up, and so keep your eyes open for that, and we hope to see you there very soon. As always, if you have questions, you can send them to the office at ncfca.org. And thank you again for your patience. I will see you in just a minute, hopefully with Dr. Loopstra.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Wonderful. Okay. Great. Well, let's see. Dr. Paul, can you join us? Let's see if we can get this moving. All right. Okay, Dr. Loopstra, are you still here with us?
Yeah, I'm here actually. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A in lieu of Dr. Paul until he can call in and connect with us that way. So starting off, lots of great questions have been coming in. And I think let's go ahead and start with several questions had to do with the history of what you mentioned, the impact of 9/11 and how that was really a pivotal point on the United States federal government's foreign policy towards terrorism. So one specific question that came in was, what would you say are the largest impacts on the common American people of 9/11 and the war on terror? So I don't know if there's some specific points that you might be able to summarize in terms of how the American people specifically have been impacted since 9/11.
Well, that's a huge question. It's an important question too, right? Because, you know, if you're in high school, you've grown up assuming many of these things have always been this way, right? So maybe you look at movies like, what is it, Sleepless in Seattle, right? And you wonder why in the world, right, Meg Ryan could see what Tom Hanks, right at the airport, and you don't have to go through security, right? So obviously for us, one of the biggest impacts was the development of Homeland Security, right? Remember that didn't exist, the department didn't exist, and the amount of money given to securing the quote-unquote homeland, right?
Right.
Remember before 9/11, as citizens, right? As before 9/11, you had local vendors, really, you know, local people at the airports, and not this united TSA, right? So maybe the young people, they don't remember that, but this really impacted us all. Can you imagine, for example, before 9/11, having those full body scanners, right? Seeing your naked image and all this. So, you know, in many ways, we've given up our privacy in exchange for safety, right? Or perceived safety in some way. So there's just so much to say there. Growing up in it, I'm sure many young people take it for granted. But even, you know, security at airports before 9/11, remember, you know, one characteristic of coming back to America was not seeing people with machine guns in airports. And, you know, nowadays you have that as well. So much has changed. I think Americans are far more aware of the threat of terrorism. Local, you know, in America, we've grown up with that now, with this idea. Of course, I'm going to give away my privacy, you know, in exchange for safety, hoping that TSA or Homeland Security or their agencies, NSA, are looking out for our security. So I think we've changed as a people in many ways. And of course, the question, you know, you'll have to face is, has it really worked? And there's actually a lot of studies that have tried to ask this question. With all the money spent on Homeland Security, right? Is it really keeping us safe from the threat of international terrorism? Many studies say, well, it was good to beef all that up, but no, you know, really, the 9/11 was a one-off attack. We don't know of any other large-scale attacks that were being planned. Why didn't, right, Al-Qaeda attack us in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 before we developed all these other institutions in America? So your students can look to a lot of great sources on that and studies. I think actually in the Cato article I mentioned, the Cato Institute article, they talk about that at some length. So for us as American citizens, we've changed quite a bit and our views on, you know, keeping terrorism in mind. Internationally, as I mentioned, we've had more direct intervention overseas, and this is the question of blowback. We've developed even prisons like Guantanamo Bay, questions of waterboarding, terrorism, you know, all these types of things were kind of inconceivable before 9/11 and the war on terror. So before 9/11, remember, terrorism was often handled nationally by the FBI. right? So there was no Homeland Security. It was kind of a national thing. I was in the military in the 1990s, so I can talk to this. Even if you remember back when we did experience terrorism in Afghanistan in the 90s, or even think of the Berlin disco attack, we did limited attacks, right? The idea was, I remember on our aircraft carrier, we would fly off missiles, and our squadron would have Tomahawks going out and attacking limited sites in Afghanistan or in Iraq in the 90s. It wasn't the types of boots on the ground, proactive, right, attempt to stamp out terrorist organizations and deny them haven. So remember I mentioned the 4Ds, right? That's the big thing, how it changed. Defeat, deny, diminish, and defend, right, U.S. interests abroad. Even if this means establishing, as Obama later would expand, right, drone bases abroad, drones that would attack terrorists in many parts of the world, like Pakistan. So I don't know if that completely answered the question, but again, there's a lot there, but you can definitely see how we've changed in American society, but also our policies have changed abroad.
No, that's very helpful. And I think you hit the nail on the head in identifying the fact that a lot of these students may take for granted that the current context they live in is how things were prior to 9/11. Because I know we had a lot of questions coming in specific to programs like TSA and surveillance and how that now ties in with the United States federal government's approach towards terrorism. So one question that's come in that I wonder if you could speak to a little bit more is, did the U.S. have any anti-terrorism measures prior to 9/11? So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and contrasting some more, and how 9/11 changed the perspective from the United States federal government's viewpoint.
Yeah, good question. Again, I can't get into a lot of details of what happened before 9/11, but we did have policies in place, right? We knew about Al-Qaeda. We were well aware of what was going on. As a historian, I know, for example, that George Bush was briefed on Al-Qaeda when coming into power. We were, of course, well aware of what was happening in Palestine with the Intifada and all those events in that region. So we were following what was happening overseas. But remember, kind of the idea was, how can they possibly attack us here, right? We're separated by an ocean abroad, right? We're kind of far away from, that's their problem, right? Where is Al-Qaeda located? Where they're in Afghanistan, right? What can these people in the mountains, do to us here? And so in the example of Al-Qaeda, we know that, again, the United States was following them, was piecing together what was happening. We were well aware of other movements of Islamic fundamentalism in that part of the world. But again, it wasn't considered as urgent. You can even bring in, for example, I'm sure your students are aware of 1980s, right? When Americans were CIA was supplying weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets, right? So we were well aware of what was happening over there, but we never kind of considered that they would have this blowback against us in the States. But again, there's other areas too. You can consider, for example, the Palestinian issue, right? So we've long had a policy trying to stop Palestinian terrorism, the Fatah movement, and the Oslo Accords. Remember, those are coming in the 1990s. So America was deeply involved, right, in trying to mitigate a lot of these issues that were ongoing. There were causes of terrorism as one of the superpowers in that region. And this is why I emphasized earlier, you got to know the history here, right? So, in order to understand even how Osama bin Laden developed, you have to know the Cold War, right? You have to know Afghanistan. To understand what's happening between Palestine and Israel, you have to understand the history of the Oslo Accords and how, again, America as a superpower tried to mitigate that. But again, a lot of this has to do with questions of definition. Who is a terrorist? You know, what is a terrorist, and all that. But again, America was definitely involved, but within a different context, right? Within the Cold War context in many ways. And as I mentioned, you know, in the Cold War, both sides were using these groups against the other to some measure.
It's actually perfect that you mentioned that, because there is a question that specifically mentioned the Cold War. And so I wonder if you could address that and speak to the issue a little bit more. The question was, is it true that both the war on terrorism and the Cold War are both ideological battles?
Oh, good question. So is the Cold War and the war on terrorism ideological? Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, the Cold War was an ideological war in many ways, right? So that branched out across the entire world. It was an ideological war in many ways, but it was a war for hearts and minds, right? So think of the Food for Peace Act, right? Passed in the 1940s, I believe, right? United States trying to get the recently independent African nations on their side against the Soviet Union. And of course, that Food for Peace Act impacts all of us in the Midwest, right? Sending cheap abroad to these newly independent countries. So in that case, yeah, you know, it was an ideological war in many ways, with all the limitations, you know, people not staying outside that box as well. But it was also, in many cases, a hot war, right? It was fought on many different fronts, though not with nuclear weapons. Is it similar to the war on terror? I don't know. That's a good question. The war on terror is definitely ideological, but it depends on which side. I think, again, my feeling is in the West, we don't really have an understanding of what we mean by terrorism, right? So, you know, if your students go to their high school and they ask them, you know, what is a terrorist? Well, you know, you might get a lot of different answers, even though we've grown up with this idea of this war on terror, right? So what is a terrorist? In the Cold War, right, people knew kind of what the Russians were, right? Or the Reds were in many ways. You could identify them. They're a nation state, right?
Right.
And again, this gets to the heart of what I mentioned with this idea of what is a nation state, and this question of ethnicity and religion. And you can't really identify in the war on terror. You can't identify one particular nation, right? You have these groups operating within nations. So in that sense, it's also quite different, right? So I'm not sure we have really an ideological approach in America to this war on terror, the same as we had with the Soviet Union. I might be wrong, but I don't think a lot of people really understand what we're fighting. But also, you know, we can't locate them in one particular nation as we could in the Cold War, right? So it's quite different in that regard, and that's a problem. And your students will have to think this through, right? Because even if we defeat Al Qaeda and even if we defeat ISIS, you haven't stamped out the ideology, right? And this is the key question you face: the backlash. You know, are you, by going in? Yeah, we can destroy them militarily, and that's part of the policy we've had. Right. But we found out over the last 17 years that has not actually stamped them out. In many ways, that's only emboldened them, right? So in that sense, it's also quite different than the Cold War. Right.
That's a great point. So you mentioned, you know, that we've touched a little bit on some of the practical policies such as surveillance and the boots on the ground and the military approach. But like you said, it's a difficult battle because it is ideological as well. So there are a couple of questions that have to do with, you know, has the United States federal government also crafted policies that specifically address the ideology and aren't necessarily boots on the ground or security measures that are put in place? Have there been any proactive policies like that? And could you speak a little bit more to that historical context?
Sure. Again, that's another great question. Yeah, actually, there's a whole other dimension as well. We know, for example, in the early days of the Bush policy, you actually had an increase in foreign aid. Remember, one of the D's of Bush was to try to stop the growth, right? The even nascent growth of the reasons for people to be involved in terrorism. And Bush and Obama, both of them felt that, well, people are joining because they're in poverty, right? So the economic situation is problematic. And so it's interesting. In 2002, Secretary of State Colin Powell made a statement that, you know, terrorism flourishes, he says, actually in areas of poverty, despair, and hopelessness when people see no future, right? So actually, the Bush administration tried to address this by increasing foreign aid overseas. I remember I mentioned the trillions of dollars we spent. And so actually foreign aid was one of the initial responses of the United States. It's not a military response, right? But foreign aid was one of the things we did. We thought this would be a way to try to alleviate poverty in the region, right? Try to get people not to go into terrorism. So this was one of the practices we've had over the years, including the Obama administration as well, increasing foreign aid, and it makes sense. The downside of that, though, has turned out to be that, well, most of the terrorists, if you remember, in the hijackers in 9/11, were not impoverished. If you go down, I don't know exactly the statistics worldwide, but at least as far as the Middle East, most of the international terrorists are actually middle class or well off, right? So they're not necessarily impoverished. So again, it goes back to that ideology. How do you fight the ideology? Yeah, the U.S. has tried to use Twitter. If you remember recently, ISIS, right? Has tried to counter ISIS's ideology on Twitter, has tried to use social media. But again, it's at least as far as I understand, it hasn't really worked. You need something local. You need something that will actually come up to replace this ideology. You know, the idea of a foreign country, you know, trying to debate an ideology that, you know, the local people say is true is kind of a strange one, right? If the United States tries to debate ideologically, so you really need, again, some underlying local replacement. And this is ongoing. I mean, we're still doing this right now with the Sunni, particularly the Sunni people in Iraq, right? I could go in more depth on that, but you recently have a new group in Iraq called the White Flags, as opposed to the Black Flags of ISIS. You know, but still, it's a Sunni group trying to, you know, wrestle authority from the Shia. So again, we're trying to stay involved, but it has to also be something local, right? That's going move people away from this ideology of radical jihad. And there's all sorts of other things people have proposed to try to move away from our aggressive policy in this war on terror. Some have even argued, you know, we need to end direct military intervention and nation building in the Middle East, right? They would argue that one of the reasons we continue to have feeding into this ideology, anti-Americanism, America as the Jahalaya, is because they see us there, because we're directly involved. And some people would say, well, let them, you know, let's remove our forces and let them. But again, that's problematic too, because then you end up having a civil war and, well, local people getting killed, and maybe we don't want to have that. So we want to support our people in that region. Real quick, the other problem with foreign aid that we found out is foreign aid does not erase the terrorists. Quite often, I think of Pakistan, right? Quite often what happens is the foreign nations like the fact that they're getting money from the U.S. to, you know, fight terrorism. So they don't eradicate the terrorist groups. They actually, you know, keep them within distance to show that they're dealing with them, but they're not erasing the threat, right? So if once they erase the threat, the money stops. Right. So that's another issue with the financial aid.
It's definitely a very complex topic. I know that's becoming apparent throughout our conversation, if it hasn't in students' research already. So you may have already hit on this a little bit in mentioning the need for some local approach and also need to replace and not just leave a vacuum. But I wonder if you, now that we've had a few years of foreign policy methods being implemented towards international terrorism, I wonder if there are any particular methods that you would note or have been widely hailed by the intelligence community as measurably successful, or at least moving in the right direction. Are there any specific policies that we can point to that have had a positive impact?
Sure. Although I've been in Iraq and Syria, I'm not in the intelligence community, so I don't know all the secret deals and all that. But if you think, for example, in the history of our dealings in Iraq, right? Consider the what we finally discovered towards 2009, 2008. The policy of dealing with local sheiks one-on-one, of developing rapport, right? Of building relationships. I think the same is true in Afghanistan. And part of that has to do with taking more indirect route, right? Allowing local people to rise up on their own to deal with the terrorist threat instead of the United States coming in. Remember in Afghanistan and Iraq, quite often what happened was when the United States would deal directly with something, they would push the Taliban or Al-Qaeda back, but then the United States would retreat, right? Would go back to their bases, leaving the local people vulnerable, right? And so for that reason, local people were not helping the Americans because they would know they would always kind of be vulnerable once the Americans left. So our policy, eventually we became to understand that we need to take a more indirect role, right? And take more multilateral channels in helping local people stand up to terrorist groups. Now, otherwise, many local people, have been put on guard. If the Americans are there, the more Islamicist bent would say, well, if you're not with us, you're with them, right? So it becomes a dualistic type of thing. But with the Americans helping more indirectly, and building that rapport, it often allows the local people to stand up and say, well, where are the Americans? They're not here, right? So we stand against you ourselves. If that makes sense.
Yes,
that's kind of one of the helpful in Iraq that's been helpful.
Okay, thank you. So somebody asked the question, are there any specific terrorist groups that you think the United States government should pay more attention to?
So specific terrorist groups.
Or maybe just identifying some specific names that they could do further research on might be helpful as well.
Sure. I think one of our problems, I think, is we lack a lot of historical depth. We tend to forget things that happened even 5 or 10 years ago, right? So if you think about it, by 2013, nobody had really heard of ISIS, right? Islamic State. And now everybody's focused on ISIS, right, at the expense of other groups. So yes, in answer to your question, we've been so focused since 2014 on ISIS that we are not watching what's happening with other groups, even Al-Qaeda, which is going to other parts of the region and growing in popularity, right, and infiltrating other groups. So even going back to keeping our eyes open to Al-Qaeda and its interests abroad, we've been so focused on certain groups like Boko Haram and ISIS that we forget other groups that are building in the region as well. So that would be one, just kind of what's the modern role of ISIS after Osama bin Laden? We thought they were dead once, but rumor has it they're still operating in the area. So we got to keep our eyes open for that. Again, I think another aspect is looking at the people from ISIS that are going back to Europe or back to other parts of the world, remembering that the ideology is there, even though the geographic range of the group has dissipated. And again, we're doing this the seesaw on Afghanistan. The Taliban are making huge moves in the area in Afghanistan, retaking territories that Americans have died for there. So we forgot them for a while, and now we're really realizing we got to turn back to them. So again, we keep going back and forth. We forget about a group for a while, and then we come back to it. And again, that would be another great topic to research. Kind of how do we not forget a group? How do we kind of nip the growth in the bud, the ideology in the bud, without tackling all the different heads, right? What we're really dealing with is an underlying ideology that can morph into anything, right? So all these different types of groups.
That's very insightful. Thank you. So I think we'll wrap it up now with this final set of questions that I'll pose as one general question here. Students have been asking about the perception of foreign nations towards U.S. policy on international terrorism. So I know that's a very broad question, as it encompasses many different nations, but I wonder if there are any specific nations' responses that you might highlight that would be helpful to students in studying this topic.
Yeah, thanks. That's a big question. Let me actually give you some perspectives from Iraq, if that's helpful.
Yes.
I teach quite often in Iraq and go to that region. Just to give you some background, I remember having a conversation with one of my students. He was a 17-year-old in college in Iraq, and we were talking as foreigners with him, and he's like, what are y'all doing here? And I said, well, we're here to help you out, to teach you. And I remember, he just couldn't believe that, right? So as Americans, we must be there, to spy, or we must be there on behalf of what he called the Zionists, right? Even when we went out to get the cheaper falafels, they were a dime cheaper outside the university instead of inside. People thought we were saving that money from the cheaper falafels to send it to the Zionists in Israel. So I give you that by background to understand that when you're dealing with many parts of the Middle East, particularly, right, and other parts of the world, what people perceive often turns out to be true, right? So their perceptions of us, even though not founded in truth, often end up being true for them. So it's something we need to be aware of. Particularly in Iraq, they're very skeptical. Many of them are very skeptical of our motivations. And you can understand why. If all you see of America is the movies, and then also you see military, in your backyard, U.S. tanks, U.S. Army. If you see U.S. planes overhead, if that's what you see of America, then you tend to think America can do anything, have its eyes anywhere, right? Spies everywhere. Can put people in power anywhere. But you also begin to think, is that all they're about? Is that America, this military force? And so, a lot of people in that region very skeptical of our interests, especially since 2003. A lot of people very disheartened. I think, for example, the Kurds, right? The Kurds, even last year, I mentioned them briefly, but the Kurds were vying for independence, right? For them, they'd been waiting for a century for this, and they were vying for independence last year. And they had been BFFs with America for so long, and they felt that surely America would support them, right? And remember, America did not step up and support the Kurds in Iraq last year, and the Kurds are really going through a crisis right now. What do we believe about America now? They didn't support us in our independence last year. So that's another issue of kind of feeling let down in some ways. Many people are fast to say we love American culture, right? We love the idea of America, right? American movies, but we just don't like what you're doing in our backyard, right? We don't know why you have to have this footprint here in our neighborhood. So that's part of the feeling. And remember, your students should understand that young people, 17-year-olds in Iraq, can get on Facebook just like they can, right? So they can see what you're doing. and they can see all the freedom you have here to speak your mind. And many of them feel, oh, boy, I wish I had that here. Right. So, like I said, is check out that really good article by Sadiq Al-Azam. It talks about kind of the Arab world being stuck right between the past and wanting to have what you have, but not being able to have that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Loopstra. That was very insightful. I know as I'm seeing these questions and comments come in that people are very grateful for your input this evening. So on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up the live Q&A. Thank you to our attendees for joining us this evening and being patient as we work through some technical difficulties. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at the office, and the email address is office@ncfca.org. We hope this has been very helpful for you in your preparation for the 2018 to 2019 competition season. And as always, we're grateful to have you join the NCFCA family this year and look forward to an incredible year of communicating truth and transforming culture together. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.